Dear friends, here is a small collection of Agatha Christie's stories about Hercule Poirot for you. This is Jason Fraser speaking. Please don't forget to subscribe and give the video a like. It will greatly support our project. Thank you so much. We wish you an enjoyable listening experience. The Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb. I have always considered that one of the most thrilling and dramatic of the many adventures I have shared with Poirot was that of our investigation into the strange series of deaths which followed upon the discovery and opening of the tomb of King Menher-Ra. Hard upon the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamen by Lord Carnarvon, Sir John Willard and Mr. Bleibner of New York, pursuing their excavations not far from Cairo, in the vicinity of the pyramids of Gizeh, came unexpectedly on a series of funeral chambers. The greatest interest was aroused by their discovery. The tomb appeared to be that of King Menher-Ra, one of those shadowy kings of the 8th dynasty, when the old kingdom was falling to decay. Little was known about this period, and the discoveries were fully reported in the newspapers. An event soon occurred which took a profound hold on the public mind. Sir John Willard died quite suddenly of heart failure. The more sensational newspapers immediately took the opportunity of reviving all the old superstitious stories connected with the ill luck of certain Egyptian treasures. The unlucky mummy at the British Museum, that hoary old chestnut, was dragged out with fresh zest, was quietly denied by the museum, but nevertheless enjoyed all its usual vogue. A fortnight later, Mr. Bleibner died of acute blood poisoning, and a few days afterwards a nephew of his shot himself in New York. The curse of Menher-Ra was the talk of the day, and the magic power of dead and gone. Egypt was exalted to a fetish point. It was then that Poirot received a brief note from Lady Willard, widow of the dead archaeologist, asking him to go and see her at her house in Kensington Square. I accompanied him. Lady Willard was a tall, thin woman, dressed in deep mourning. Her haggard face bore eloquent testimony to her recent grief. "It is kind of you to have come so promptly, Monsieur Poirot." "I am at your service, Lady Willard. You wish to consult me." "You are, I am aware, a detective, but it is not only as a detective that I wish to consult you. You are a man of original views, I know. You have imagination, experience of the world. Tell me, Monsieur Poirot, what are your views on the supernatural?" Poirot hesitated for a moment before he replied. He seemed to be considering. Finally he said, "Let us not misunderstand each other, Lady Willard. It is not a general question that you are asking me there. It has a personal application, has it not? You are referring obliquely to the death of your late husband?" "That is so," she admitted. "Yes. You want me to investigate the circumstances of his death?" "I want you to ascertain for me exactly how much is newspaper chatter, and how much may be said to be founded on fact. 3 deaths, Monsieur Poirot, each one explicable, taken by itself, but taken together surely an almost unbelievable coincidence, and all within a month of the opening of the tomb. It may be mere superstition, it may be some potent curse from the past that operates in ways undreamed of by modern science. The fact remains: 3 deaths. And I am afraid, Monsieur Poirot, horribly afraid. It may not yet be the end." "For whom do you fear?" "For my son. When the news of my husband's death came, I was ill. My son, who has just come down from Oxford, went out there. He brought the body home, but now he has gone out again, in spite of my prayers and entreaties. He is so fascinated by the work that he intends to take his father's place and carry on the system of excavations. You may think me a foolish, credulous woman, but, Monsieur Poirot, I am afraid. Supposing that the spirit of the dead king is not yet appeased. Perhaps to you I seem to be talking nonsense." "No, indeed, Lady Willard," said Poirot quickly. "I, too, believe in the force of superstition, one of the greatest forces the world has ever known." I looked at him in surprise. I should never have credited Poirot with being superstitious, but the little man was obviously in earnest. "What you really demand is that I shall protect your son. I will do my utmost to keep him from harm. Yes, in the ordinary way, but against an occult influence. In volumes of the Middle Ages, Lady Willard, you will find many ways of counteracting black magic. Perhaps they knew more than we moderns with all our boasted science. Now let us come to facts, that I may have guidance. Your husband had always been a devoted Egyptologist, hadn't he? Yes, from his youth upwards. He was one of the greatest living authorities upon the subject. But Mr. Bleibner, I understand, was more or less of an amateur. Oh, quite. He was a very wealthy man who dabbled freely in any subject that happened to take his fancy. My husband managed to interest him in Egyptology, and it was his money that was so useful in financing the expedition. And the nephew? What do you know of his tastes? Was he with the party at all? I do not think so. In fact, I never knew of his existence till I read of his death in the paper. I do not think he and Mr. Bleibner can have been at all intimate. He never spoke of having any relations. Who are the other members of the party? Well, there is Dr. Toswell, a minor official connected with the British Museum, Mr. Schneider of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, a young American secretary, Dr. Ames, who accompanies the expedition in his professional capacity, and Hassan, my husband's devoted native servant. Do you remember the name of the American secretary? Harper, I think, but I cannot be sure. He had not been with Mr. Bleibner very long, I know. He was a very pleasant young fellow. Thank you, Lady Willard. If there is anything else— For the moment, nothing. Leave it now in my hands, and be assured that I will do all that is humanly possible to protect your son. They were not exactly reassuring words, and I observed Lady Willard wince as he uttered them. Yet, at the same time, the fact that he had not pooh-poohed her fears seemed in itself to be a relief to her. For my part, I had never before suspected that Poirot had so deep a vein of superstition in his nature. I tackled him on the subject as we went homewards. His manner was grave and earnest. But yes, Hastings, I believe in these things. You must not underrate the force of superstition. What are we going to do about it? Toujours pratique, the good Hastings. Eh bien, to begin with, we are going to cable to New York for fuller details of young Mr. Bleibner's death. He duly sent off his cable. The reply was full and precise. Young Rupert Bleibner had been in low water for several years. He had been a beachcomber and a remittance man in several South Sea islands, but had returned to New York 2 years ago, where he had rapidly sunk lower and lower. The most significant thing, to my mind, was that he had recently managed to borrow enough money to take him to Egypt. "I've a good friend there I can borrow from," he had declared. Here, however, his plans had gone awry. He had returned to New York, cursing his skinflint of an uncle who cared more for the bones of dead and gone kings than his own flesh and blood. It was during his sojourn in Egypt that the death of Sir John Willard occurred. Rupert had plunged once more into his life of dissipation in New York, and then, without warning, he had committed suicide, leaving behind him a letter which contained some curious phrases. It seemed written in a sudden fit of remorse. He referred to himself as a leper and an outcast, and the letter ended by declaring that such as he were better dead. A shadowy theory leapt into my brain. I had never really believed in the vengeance of a long-dead Egyptian king. I saw here a more modern crime. Supposing this young man had decided to do away with his uncle, preferably by poison. By mistake, Sir John Willard receives the fatal dose. The young man returns to New York, haunted by his crime. The news of his uncle's death reaches him. He realizes how unnecessary his crime has been, and stricken with remorse takes his own life. I outlined my solution to Poirot. He was interested. "It is ingenious what you have thought of there. Decidedly, it is ingenious. It may even be true. But you leave out of count the fatal influence of the tomb." I shrugged my shoulders. "You still think that has something to do with it?" "So much so, mon ami, that we start for Egypt tomorrow." "What?" I cried, astonished. "I have said it." An expression of conscious heroism spread over Poirot's face. Then he groaned. "But oh," he lamented, "the sea! The hateful sea!" It was a week later. Beneath our feet was the golden sand of the desert. The hot sun poured down overhead. Poirot, the picture of misery, wilted by my side. The little man was not a good traveller. Our 4 days' voyage from Marseille had been one long agony to him. He had landed at Alexandria, the wraith of his former self. Even his usual neatness had deserted him. We had arrived in Cairo, and had driven out at once to the Mina House Hotel, right in the shadow of the pyramids. The charm of Egypt had laid hold of me. Not so Poirot. Dressed precisely the same as in London, he carried a small clothes-brush in his pocket and waged an unceasing war on the dust which accumulated on his dark apparel. "And my boots," he wailed. "Regard them, Hastings. My boots, of the neat patent leather, usually so smart and shining. See, the sand is inside them, which is painful, and outside them, which outrages the eyesight. Also the heat, it causes my moustaches to become limp, but limp." "Look at the Sphinx," I urged. "Even I can feel the mystery and the charm it exhales." Poirot looked at it discontentedly. "It has not the air happy," he declared. "How could it, half buried in sand in that untidy fashion? Ah, this cursed sand." "Come now, there's a lot of sand in Belgium," I reminded him, mindful of a holiday spent at Nocques-sur-Mer in the midst of les dunes impeccables, as the guidebook had phrased it. "Not in Brussels," declared Poirot. He gazed at the pyramids thoughtfully. "It is true that they, at least, are of a shape solid and geometrical, but their surface is of an unevenness most unpleasing. And the palm trees, I like them not. Not even do they plant them in rows." I cut short his lamentations by suggesting that we should start for the camp. We were to ride there on camels, and the beasts were patiently kneeling, waiting for us to mount, in charge of several picturesque boys headed by a voluble dragoman. I pass over the spectacle of Poirot on a camel. He started by groans and lamentations, and ended by shrieks, gesticulations, and invocations to the Virgin Mary and every saint in the calendar. In the end, he descended ignominiously and finished the journey on a diminutive donkey. I must admit that a trotting camel is no joke for the amateur. I was stiff for several days. At last we neared the scene of the excavations. A sunburnt man with a grey beard, in white clothes and wearing a helmet, came to meet us. "Monsieur Poirot and Captain Hastings, we received your cable. I am sorry that there was no one to meet you in Cairo. An unforeseen event occurred which completely disorganized our plans." Poirot paled. His hand, which had stolen to his clothes-brush, stayed its course. "Not another death?" he breathed. "Yes." "Sir Guy Willard," I cried. "No, Captain Hastings. My American colleague, Mr. Schneider." "And the cause?" demanded Poirot. "Tetanus!" I blanched. All around me I seemed to feel an atmosphere of evil, subtle and menacing. A horrible thought flashed across me, supposing I were the next. "Mon Dieu," said Poirot, in a very low voice, "I do not understand this. It is horrible. Tell me, monsieur, there is no doubt that it was tetanus?" "I believe not, but Dr. Ames will tell you more than I can do." "Ah, of course you are not the doctor." "My name is Toswill." This, then, was the British expert described by Lady Willard as being a minor official at the British Museum. There was something at once grave and steadfast about him that took my fancy. "If you will come with me," continued Dr. Toswill, "I will take you to Sir Guy Willard. He was most anxious to be informed as soon as you should arrive." We were taken across the camp to a large tent. Dr. Toswill lifted up the flap, and we entered. 3 men were sitting inside. "Monsieur Poirot and Captain Hastings have arrived, Sir Guy," said Toswill. The youngest of the 3 men jumped up and came forward to greet us. There was a certain impulsiveness in his manner which reminded me of his mother. He was not nearly so sunburnt as the others, and that fact, coupled with a certain haggardness round the eyes, made him look older than his 22 years. He was clearly endeavouring to bear up under a severe mental strain. He introduced his 2 companions, Dr. Ames, a capable-looking man of 30-odd, with a touch of greying hair at the temples, and Mr. Harper, the secretary, a pleasant, lean young man wearing the national insignia of horn-rimmed spectacles. After a few minutes' desultory conversation, the latter went out, and Dr. Toswill followed him. We were left alone with Sir Guy and Dr. Ames. "Please ask any questions you want to ask, Monsieur Poirot," said Willard. "We are utterly dumbfounded at this strange series of disasters, but it isn't. It can't be. Anything but coincidence." There was a nervousness about his manner which rather belied the words. I saw that Poirot was studying him keenly. "Your heart is really in this work, Sir Guy?" "Rather. No matter what happens or what comes of it, the work is going on. Make up your mind to that." Poirot wheeled round on the other. "What have you to say to that, Monsieur le Docteur?" "Well," drawled the doctor, "I'm not for quitting myself." Poirot made one of those expressive grimaces of his. "Then, évidemment, we must find out just how we stand. When did Mr. Schneider's death take place?" 3 days ago." "You are sure it was tetanus?" "Dead sure." "It couldn't have been a case of strychnine poisoning, for instance?" "No, Monsieur Poirot. I see what you're getting at. But it was a clear case of tetanus." "Did you not inject anti-serum?" "Certainly we did," said the doctor dryly. "Every conceivable thing that could be done was tried." "Had you the anti-serum with you?" "No. We procured it from Cairo." "Have there been any other cases of tetanus in the camp?" "No, not one." "Are you certain that the death of Mr. Bleibner was not due to tetanus?" "Absolutely plumb certain. He had a scratch upon his thumb which became poisoned, and septicemia set in. It sounds pretty much the same to a layman, I dare say, but the two things are entirely different. Then we have 4 deaths, all totally dissimilar, 1 heart failure, 1 blood poisoning, 1 suicide, and 1 tetanus." "Exactly, Monsieur Poirot. Are you certain that there is nothing which might link the 4 together?" "I don't quite understand you." "I will put it plainly. Was any act committed by those 4 men which might seem to denote disrespect to the spirit of Men-Hera?" The doctor gazed at Poirot in astonishment. "You're talking through your hat, Monsieur Poirot. Surely you've not been guyed into believing all that fool talk?" "Absolute nonsense," muttered Willard angrily. Poirot remained placidly immovable, blinking a little out of his green cat's eyes. "So you do not believe it, Monsieur le Docteur?" "No, sir, I do not," declared the doctor emphatically. "I am a scientific man, and I believe only what science teaches." "Was there no science, then, in ancient Egypt?" asked Poirot softly. He did not wait for a reply, and indeed, Dr. Ames seemed rather at a loss for the moment. No, do not answer me, but tell me this. What do the native workmen think?" "I guess," said Dr. Ames, "that where white folk lose their heads, natives aren't going to be far behind. I'll admit that they're getting what you might call scared, but they've no cause to be." "I wonder," said Poirot non-committally. Sir Guy leant forward. "Surely," he cried incredulously, "you cannot believe in— Oh, but the thing's absurd. You can know nothing of ancient Egypt if you think that." For answer, Poirot produced a little book from his pocket, an ancient, tattered volume. As he held it out, I saw its title, The Magic of the Egyptians and Chaldeans. Then, wheeling round, he strode out of the tent. The doctor stared at me. "What is his little idea?" The phrase, so familiar on Poirot's lips, made me smile as it came from another. "I don't know exactly," I confessed. "He's got some plan of exorcising the evil spirits, I believe." I went in search of Poirot and found him talking to the lean-faced young man who had been the late Mr. Bleibner's secretary. "No," Mr. Harper was saying. "I've only been 6 months with the expedition. Yes, I knew Mr. Bleibner's affairs pretty well. Can you recount to me anything concerning his nephew?" "He turned up here one day. Not a bad-looking fellow. I'd never met him before, but some of the others had. Ames, I think, and Schneider. The old man wasn't at all pleased to see him. They were at it in no time, hammer and tongs. 'Not a cent,' the old man shouted. 'Not 1 cent now or when I'm dead. I intend to leave my money to the furtherance of my life's work. I've been talking it over with Mr. Schneider today.' And a bit more of the same. Young Bleibner lit out for Cairo right away. Was he in perfectly good health at the time?" "The old man?" "No, the young one. I believe he did mention there was something wrong with him, but it couldn't have been anything serious, or I should have remembered. One thing more, has Mr. Bleibner left a will? So far as we know, he has not. Are you remaining with the expedition, Mr. Harper? No, sir, I'm not. I'm for New York as soon as I can square up things here. You may laugh if you like, but I'm not going to be this blasted old Men-Her-Ra's next victim. He'll get me if I stop here. The young man wiped the perspiration from his brow. Poirot turned away. Over his shoulder he said with a peculiar smile, "Remember, he got one of his victims in New York." "Oh, hell!" said Mr. Harper forcibly. "That young man is nervous," said Poirot thoughtfully. "He is on the edge, but absolutely on the edge." I glanced at Poirot curiously, but his enigmatical smile told me nothing. In company with Sir Guy Willard and Dr. Toswill, we were taken round the excavations. The principal finds had been removed to Cairo, but some of the tomb furniture was extremely interesting. The enthusiasm of the young baronet was obvious, but I fancied that I detected a shade of nervousness in his manner, as though he could not quite escape from the feeling of menace in the air. As we entered the tent which had been assigned to us for a wash before joining the evening meal, a tall, dark figure in white robes stood aside to let us pass with a graceful gesture and a murmured greeting in Arabic. Poirot stopped. "You are Hassan, the late Sir John Willard's servant?" "I served my Lord Sir John. Now I serve his son." He took a step nearer to us and lowered his voice. "You are a wise one, they say, learned in dealing with evil spirits. Let the young master depart from here. There is evil in the air around us." And with an abrupt gesture, not waiting for a reply, he strode away. "Evil in the air," muttered Poirot. "Yes, I feel it." Our meal was hardly a cheerful one. The floor was left to Dr. Toswill, who discoursed at length upon Egyptian antiquities. Just as we were preparing to retire to rest, Sir Guy caught Poirot by the arm and pointed. A shadowy figure was moving amidst the tents. It was no human one. I recognized distinctly the dog-headed figure I had seen carved on the walls of the tomb. My blood literally froze at the sight. "Mon Dieu!" murmured Poirot, crossing himself vigorously. "Anubis, the jackal-headed, the god of departing souls." "Someone is hoaxing us," cried Dr. Toswill, rising indignantly to his feet. "It went into your tent, Harper," muttered Sir Guy, his face dreadfully pale. "No?" said Poirot, shaking his head. "Into that of the Dr. Ames." The doctor stared at him incredulously. Then, repeating Dr. Toswill's words, he cried, "Someone is hoaxing us! Come, we'll soon catch the fellow." He dashed energetically in pursuit of the shadowy apparition. I followed him, but, search as we would, we could find no trace of any living soul having passed that way. We returned, somewhat disturbed in mind, to find Poirot taking energetic measures, in his own way, to ensure his personal safety. He was busily surrounding our tent with various diagrams and inscriptions which he was drawing in the sand. I recognized the five-pointed star or pentagon many times repeated. As was his wont, Poirot was at the same time delivering an impromptu lecture on witchcraft and magic in general, white magic as opposed to black, with various references to the Ka and the Book of the Dead thrown in. It appeared to excite the liveliest contempt in Dr. Toswill, who drew me aside, literally snorting with rage. "Balderdash, sir!" he exclaimed angrily. "Pure balderdash! The man's an impostor. He doesn't know the difference between the superstitions of the Middle Ages and the beliefs of ancient Egypt. Never have I heard such a hotchpotch of ignorance and credulity." I calmed the excited expert and joined Poirot in the tent. My little friend was beaming cheerfully. "We can now sleep in peace," he declared happily. "And I can do with some sleep. My head, it aches abominably. Ah, for a good tisane." As though in answer to prayer, the flap of the tent was lifted, and Hassan appeared, bearing a steaming cup which he offered to Poirot. It proved to be chamomile tea, a beverage of which he is inordinately fond. Having thanked Hassan and refused his offer of another cup for myself, we were left alone once more. I stood at the door of the tent some time after undressing, looking out over the desert. "A wonderful place," I said aloud, "and a wonderful work. I can feel the fascination. This desert life, this probing into the heart of a vanished civilization. Surely, Poirot, you too must feel the charm." I got no answer, and I turned, a little annoyed. My annoyance was quickly changed to concern. Poirot was lying back across the rude couch, his face horribly convulsed. Beside him was the empty cup. I rushed to his side, then dashed out and across the camp to Dr. Ames's tent. "Dr. Ames!" I cried. "Come at once!" "What's the matter?" said the doctor, appearing in pyjamas. "My friend. He's ill. Dying. The chamomile tea. Don't let Hassan leave the camp." Like a flash, the doctor ran to our tent. Poirot was lying as I left him. "Extraordinary!" cried Ames. "Looks like a seizure, or what did you say about something he drank?" He picked up the empty cup. "Only I did not drink it," said a placid voice. We turned in amazement. Poirot was sitting up on the bed. He was smiling. "No," he said gently. "I did not drink it. While my good friend Hastings was apostrophizing the night, I took the opportunity of pouring it, not down my throat, but into a little bottle. That little bottle will go to the analytical chemist. No," as the doctor made a sudden movement, "as a sensible man, you will understand that violence will be of no avail. During Hastings' brief absence to fetch you, I have had time to put the bottle in safe keeping. Ah, quick, Hastings. Hold him." I misunderstood Poirot's anxiety. Eager to save my friend, I flung myself in front of him. But the doctor's swift movement had another meaning. His hand went to his mouth, a smell of bitter almonds filled the air, and he swayed forward and fell. "Another victim," said Poirot gravely. "But the last. Perhaps it is the best way. He has 3 deaths on his head." "Dr. Ames?" I cried, stupefied. "But I thought you believed in some occult influence." "You misunderstood me, Hastings. What I meant was that I believe in the terrific force of superstition. Once get it firmly established that a series of deaths are supernatural, and you might almost stab a man in broad daylight, and it would still be put down to the curse, so strongly is the instinct of the supernatural implanted in the human race. I suspected from the first that a man was taking advantage of that instinct. The idea came to him, I imagine, with the death of Sir John Willard. A fury of superstition arose at once. As far as I could see, nobody could derive any particular profit from Sir John's death. Mr. Bleibner was a different case. He was a man of great wealth. The information I received from New York contained several suggestive points. To begin with, young Bleibner was reported to have said he had a good friend in Egypt from whom he could borrow. It was tacitly understood that he meant his uncle, but it seemed to me that in that case he would have said so outright. The words suggest some boon companion of his own. Another thing, he scraped up enough money to take him to Egypt. His uncle refused outright to advance him a penny, yet he was able to pay the return passage to New York. Someone must have lent him the money. All that was very thin, I objected. But there was more. Hastings. There occur often enough words spoken metaphorically which are taken literally. The opposite can happen too. In this case, words which were meant literally were taken metaphorically. Young Bleibner wrote plainly enough, "I am a leper." But nobody realized that he shot himself because he believed that he had contracted the dread disease of leprosy. "What?" I ejaculated. It was the clever invention of a diabolical mind. Young Bleibner was suffering from some minor skin trouble. He had lived in the South Sea Islands, where the disease is common enough. Ames was a former friend of his and a well-known medical man. He would never dream of doubting his word. When I arrived here, my suspicions were divided between Harper and Dr. Ames, but I soon realized that only the doctor could have perpetrated and concealed the crimes, and I learnt from Harper that he was previously acquainted with young Bleibner. Doubtless the latter at some time or another had made a will, or had insured his life in favour of the doctor. The latter saw his chance of acquiring wealth. It was easy for him to inoculate Mr. Bleibner with the deadly germs. Then the nephew, overcome with despair at the dread news his friend had conveyed to him, shot himself. Mr. Bleibner, whatever his intentions, had made no will. His fortune would pass to his nephew, and from him to the doctor. And Mr. Schneider? We cannot be sure. He knew young Bleibner too, remember, and may have suspected something, or, again, the doctor may have thought that a further death, motiveless and purposeless, would strengthen the coils of superstition. Furthermore, I will tell you an interesting psychological fact, Hastings. A murderer has always a strong desire to repeat his successful crime. The performance of it grows upon him. Hence my fears for young Willard. The figure of Anubis you saw tonight was Hassan, dressed up by my orders. I wanted to see if I could frighten the doctor, but it would take more than the supernatural to frighten him. I could see that he was not entirely taken in by my pretenses of belief in the occult. The little comedy I played for him did not deceive him. I suspected that he would endeavour to make me the next victim. Ah, but in spite of la mer maudite, the heat abominable, and the annoyances of the sand, the little grey cells still functioned. Poirot proved to be perfectly right in his premises. Young Bleibner, some years ago, in a fit of drunken merriment, had made a jocular will, leaving my cigarette case you admire so much and everything else of which I die possessed, which will be principally debts to my good friend Robert Ames, who once saved my life from drowning. The case was hushed up as far as possible, and to this day people talk of the remarkable series of deaths in connection with the tomb of Men-Her-Ra as a triumphal proof of the vengeance of a bygone king upon the desecrators of his tomb, a belief which, as Poirot pointed out to me, is contrary to all Egyptian belief and thought. The disappearance of Mr. Davenheim. Poirot and I were expecting our old friend Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard to tea. We were sitting round the tea-table awaiting his arrival. Poirot had just finished carefully straightening the cups and saucers which our landlady was in the habit of throwing rather than placing on the table. He had also breathed heavily on the metal teapot and polished it with a silk handkerchief. The kettle was on the boil, and a small enamel saucepan beside it contained some thick, sweet chocolate, which was more to Poirot's palate than what he described as your English poison. A sharp rat-tat sounded below, and a few minutes afterwards Japp entered briskly. "Hope I'm not late," he said as he greeted us. "To tell the truth, I was yarning with Miller, the man who's in charge of the Davenheim case." I pricked up my ears. For the last 3 days the papers had been full of the strange disappearance of Mr. Davenheim, senior partner of Davenheim and Salmon, the well-known bankers and financiers. On Saturday last he had walked out of his house and had never been seen since. I looked forward to extracting some interesting details from Japp. "I should have thought," I remarked, "that it would be almost impossible for anyone to disappear nowadays." Poirot moved a plate of bread and butter the 1/8 of an inch and said sharply, "Be exact, my friend. What do you mean by disappear? To which class of disappearance are you referring?" "Are disappearances classified and labelled, then?" I laughed. Japp smiled also. Poirot frowned at us both. "But certainly they are. They fall into 3 categories. First, and most common, the voluntary disappearance. Second, the much-abused loss of memory case, rare, but occasionally genuine. Third, murder, and a more or less successful disposal of the body. Do you refer to all 3 as impossible of execution?" "Very nearly so, I should think. You might lose your own memory, but someone would be sure to recognize you, especially in the case of a well-known man like Davenheim. Then bodies can't be made to vanish into thin air. Sooner or later they turn up, concealed in lonely places, or in trunks. Murder will out. In the same way, the absconding clerk, or the domestic defaulter, is bound to be run down in these days of wireless telegraphy. He can be headed off from foreign countries. Ports and railway stations are watched. And as for concealment in this country, his features and appearance will be known to everyone who reads a daily newspaper. He's up against civilization." "Mon ami," said Poirot, "you make one error. You do not allow for the fact that a man who had decided to make away with another man, or with himself in a figurative sense, might be that rare machine, a man of method. He might bring intelligence, talent, a careful calculation of detail to the task, and then I do not see why he should not be successful in baffling the police force." "But not you, I suppose?" said Japp, good-humouredly, winking at me. "He couldn't baffle you, eh, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot endeavoured, with a marked lack of success, to look modest. "Me also? Why not? It is true that I approach such problems with an exact science, a mathematical precision, which seems, alas, only too rare in the new generation of detectives." Japp grinned more widely. "I don't know," he said. "Miller, the man who's on this case, is a smart chap. You may be very sure he won't overlook a footprint, or a cigar ash, or a crumb even. He's got eyes that see everything." "So, mon ami," said Poirot, "has the London Sparrow. But all the same I should not ask the little brown bird to solve the problem of Mr. Davenheim." "Come now, monsieur. You're not going to run down the value of details as clues?" "By no means. These things are all good in their way. The danger is they may assume undue importance. Most details are insignificant. One or two are vital. It is the brain, the little grey cells," he tapped his forehead, "on which one must rely. The senses mislead. One must seek the truth within, not without." "You don't mean to say, Monsieur Poirot, that you would undertake to solve a case without moving from your chair, do you?" "That is exactly what I do mean. Granted the facts were placed before me, I regard myself as a consulting specialist." Japp slapped his knee. "Hanged if I don't take you at your word. Bet you a fiver that you can't lay your hand, or rather tell me where to lay my hand, on Mr. Davenheim, dead or alive, before a week is out." Poirot considered. "Eh bien, mon ami, I accept. Le sport, it is the passion of you English. Now, the facts." "On Saturday last, as is his usual custom, Mr. Davenheim took the 12:40 train from Victoria to Chingside, where his palatial country place, the Cedars, is situated. After lunch, he strolled round the grounds and gave various directions to the gardeners. Everybody agrees that his manner was absolutely normal and as usual. After tea, he put his head into his wife's boudoir, saying that he was going to stroll down to the village and post some letters. He added that he was expecting a Mr. Lowen on business. If he should come before he himself returned, he was to be shown into the study and asked to wait. Mr. Davenheim then left the house by the front door, passed leisurely down the drive, and out at the gate, and was never seen again. From that hour he vanished completely. "Pretty, very pretty, altogether a charming little problem," murmured Poirot. "Proceed, my good friend." About a quarter of an hour later, a tall, dark man with a thick black moustache rang the front door bell and explained that he had an appointment with Mr. Davenheim. He gave the name of Lowen, and in accordance with the banker's instructions was shown into the study. Nearly an hour passed. Mr. Davenheim did not return. Finally, Mr. Lowen rang the bell and explained that he was unable to wait any longer, as he must catch his train back to town. Mrs. Davenheim apologized for her husband's absence, which seemed unaccountable, as she knew him to have been expecting the visitor. Mr. Lowen reiterated his regrets and took his departure. Well, as everyone knows, Mr. Davenheim did not return. Early on Sunday morning the police were communicated with, but could make neither head nor tail of the matter. Mr. Davenheim seemed literally to have vanished into thin air. He had not been to the post office, nor had he been seen passing through the village. At the station, they were positive he had not departed by any train. His own motor had not left the garage. If he had hired a car to meet him in some lonely spot, it seems almost certain that by this time, in view of the large reward offered for information, the driver of it would have come forward to tell what he knew. True, there was a small race meeting at Enfield, 5 miles away, and if he had walked to that station, he might have passed unnoticed in the crowd. But since then, his photograph and a full description of him have been circulated in every newspaper, and nobody has been able to give any news of him. We have, of course, received many letters from all over England, but each clue so far has ended in disappointment. On Monday morning a further sensational discovery came to light. Behind a portiere in Mr. Davenham's study stands a safe, and that safe had been broken into and rifled. The windows were fastened securely on the inside, which seems to put an ordinary burglary out of court, unless of course an accomplice within the house fastened them again afterwards. On the other hand, Sunday having intervened and the household being in a state of chaos, it is likely that the burglary was committed on the Saturday and remained undetected until Monday. Précisément, said Poirot dryly. Well, is he arrested, ce pauvre Monsieur Lowen? Japp grinned. Not yet, but he's under pretty close supervision. Poirot nodded. What was taken from the safe? Have you any idea? We've been going into that with the junior partner of the firm and Mrs. Davenham. Apparently there was a considerable amount in bearer bonds, and a very large sum in notes, owing to some large transaction having been just carried through. There was also a small fortune in jewellery. All Mrs. Davenham's jewels were kept in the safe. The purchasing of them had become a passion with her husband of late years, and hardly a month passed that he did not make her a present of some rare and costly gem. Altogether a good haul, said Poirot thoughtfully. Now, what about Lowen? Is it known what his business was with Davenham that evening? Well, the two men were apparently not on very good terms. Lowen is a speculator in quite a small way. Nevertheless, he has been able once or twice to score a coup off Davenham in the market, though it seems they seldom or never actually met. It was a matter concerning some South American shares, which led the banker to make his appointment. Had Davenham interests in South America, then? I believe so. Mrs. Davenham happened to mention that he spent all last autumn in Buenos Aires. Any trouble in his home life? Were the husband and wife on good terms? I should say his domestic life was quite peaceful and uneventful. Mrs. Davenham is a pleasant, rather unintelligent woman. Quite a nonentity, I think. Then we must not look for the solution of the mystery there. Had he any enemies? He had plenty of financial rivals, and no doubt there are many people whom he has got the better of who bear him no particular goodwill. But there was no one likely to make away with him, and if they had, where is the body? Exactly. As Hastings says, bodies have a habit of coming to light with fatal persistency. By the way, one of the gardeners says he saw a figure going round to the side of the house toward the rose garden. The long French window of the study opens onto the rose garden, and Mr. Davenham frequently entered and left the house that way. But the man was a good way off, at work on some cucumber frames, and cannot even say whether it was the figure of his master or not. Also, he cannot fix the time with any accuracy. It must have been before 6, as the gardeners cease work at that time. And Mr. Davenham left the house? About 5:30 or thereabouts. What lies beyond the rose garden? A lake. With a boathouse? Yes, a couple of punts are kept there. I suppose you're thinking of suicide, Monsieur Poirot? Well, I don't mind telling you that Miller's going down tomorrow expressly to see that piece of water dragged. That's the kind of man he is. Poirot smiled faintly, and turned to me. Hastings, I pray you, hand me that copy of the Daily Megaphone. If I remember rightly, there is an unusually clear photograph there of the missing man. I rose and found the sheet required. Poirot studied the features attentively. He murmured. Wears his hair rather long and wavy, full moustache and pointed beard, bushy eyebrows. Eyes dark? Yes. Hair and beard turning grey? The detective nodded. Well, Monsieur Poirot, what have you got to say to it all? Clear as daylight, eh? On the contrary, most obscure. The Scotland Yard man looked pleased. Which gives me great hopes of solving it, finished Poirot placidly. Eh? I find it a good sign when a case is obscure. If a thing is clear as daylight, eh bien, mistrust it. Someone has made it so. Japp shook his head almost pityingly. Well, each to their fancy, but it's not a bad thing to see your way clear ahead. I do not see, murmured Poirot. I shut my eyes and think. Japp sighed. Well, you've got a clear week to think in. And you will bring me any fresh developments that arise. The result of the labours of the hard-working and lynx-eyed Inspector Miller, for instance. Certainly. That's in the bargain. Seems a shame, doesn't it? Said Japp to me as I accompanied him to the door. Like robbing a child. I could not help agreeing with a smile. I was still smiling as I re-entered the room. Eh bien, said Poirot immediately. You make fun of Papa Poirot, is it not so? He shook his finger at me. You do not trust his grey cells? Ah, do not be confused. Let us discuss this little problem. Incomplete as yet, I admit, but already showing 1 or 2 points of interest. The lake, I said significantly. And even more than the lake, the boathouse. I looked sidewise at Poirot. He was smiling in his most inscrutable fashion. I felt that, for the moment, it would be quite useless to question him further. We heard nothing of Japp until the following evening, when he walked in about 9 o'clock. I saw at once by his expression that he was bursting with news of some kind. Eh bien, my friend, remarked Poirot, all goes well? But do not tell me that you have discovered the body of Mr. Davenheim in your lake, because I shall not believe you. We haven't found the body, but we did find his clothes, the identical clothes he was wearing that day. What do you say to that? Any other clothes missing from the house? No, his valet is quite positive on that point. The rest of his wardrobe is intact. There's more. We've arrested Lowen. One of the maids, whose business it is to fasten the bedroom windows, declares that she saw Lowen coming towards the study through the rose garden about 6:15. That would be about 10 minutes before he left the house. What does he himself say to that? Denied, first of all, that he had ever left the study. But the maid was positive, and he pretended afterwards that he had forgotten just stepping out of the window to examine an unusual species of rose. Rather a weak story. And there's fresh evidence against him come to light. Mr. Davenheim always wore a thick gold ring set with a solitaire diamond on the little finger of his right hand. Well, that ring was pawned in London on Saturday night by a man called Billy Kellett. He's already known to the police. Did 3 months last autumn for lifting an old gentleman's watch. It seems he tried to pawn the ring at no less than 5 different places, succeeded at the last one, got gloriously drunk on the proceeds, assaulted a policeman, and was run in consequence. I went to Bow Street with Miller and saw him. He's sober enough now, and I don't mind admitting we pretty well frightened the life out of him, hinting he might be charged with murder. This is his yarn, and a very queer one it is. He was at Enfield races on Saturday, though I dare say scarfpins was his line of business rather than betting. Anyway, he had a bad day, and was down on his luck. He was tramping along the road to Chingside, and sat down in a ditch to rest just before he got into the village. A few minutes later, he noticed a man coming along the road to the village, dark-complexioned gent with a big moustache, one of them city toffs, is his description of the man. Kellett was half concealed from the road by a heap of stones. Just before he got abreast of him, the man looked quickly up and down the road, and seeing it apparently deserted, he took a small object from his pocket and threw it over the hedge. Then he went on towards the station. Now, the object he had thrown over the hedge had fallen with a slight chink, which aroused the curiosity of the human derelict in the ditch. He investigated and, after a short search, discovered the ring. That is Kellett's story. It's only fair to say that Lowen denies it utterly, and of course the word of a man like Kellett can't be relied upon in the slightest. It's within the bounds of possibility that he met Davenheim in the lane and robbed and murdered him. Poirot shook his head. Very improbable, mon ami. He had no means of disposing of the body. It would have been found by now. Secondly, the open way in which he pawned the ring makes it unlikely that he did murder to get it. Thirdly, your sneak thief is rarely a murderer. Fourthly, as he has been in prison since Saturday, it would be too much of a coincidence that he is able to give so accurate a description of Lowen. Japp nodded. I don't say you're not right, but all the same, you won't get a jury to take much note of a jailbird's evidence. What seems odd to me is that Lowen couldn't find a cleverer way of disposing of the ring. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. Well, after all, if it were found in the neighbourhood, it might be argued that Davenheim himself had dropped it. But why remove it from the body at all? I cried. "There might be a reason for that," said Japp. "Do you know that just beyond the lake, a little gate leads out onto the hill, and not 3 minutes' walk brings you to, what do you think, a lime kiln?" "Good heavens!" I cried. "You mean that the lime which destroyed the body would be powerless to affect the metal of the ring?" "Exactly." "It seems to me," I said, that explains everything. What a horrible crime." By common consent we both turned and looked at Poirot. He seemed lost in reflection, his brow knitted as though with some supreme mental effort. I felt that at last his keen intellect was asserting itself. What would his first words be? We were not long left in doubt. With a sigh, the tension of his attitude relaxed, and turning to Japp, he asked, "Have you any idea, my friend, whether Mr. and Mrs. Davenheim occupied the same bedroom?" The question seemed so ludicrously inappropriate that for a moment we both stared in silence. Then Japp burst into a laugh. "Good Lord, Monsieur Poirot, I thought you were coming out with something startling. As to your question, I'm sure I don't know." "You could find out?" asked Poirot with curious persistence. "Oh, certainly, if you really want to know." "Merci, mon ami. I should be obliged if you would make a point of it." Japp stared at him a few minutes longer, but Poirot seemed to have forgotten us both. The detective shook his head sadly at me and, murmuring, "Poor old fellow, war's been too much for him," gently withdrew from the room. As Poirot still seemed sunk in a daydream, I took a sheet of paper and amused myself by scribbling notes upon it. My friend's voice aroused me. He had come out of his reverie and was looking brisk and alert. "Que faites-vous là, mon ami?" I was jotting down what occurred to me as the main points of interest in this affair. "You become methodical, at last," said Poirot approvingly. I concealed my pleasure. "Shall I read them to you?" "By all means." I cleared my throat. 1. All the evidence points to Lowen having been the man who forced the safe. 2. He had a grudge against Davenheim. 3. He lied in his first statement that he had never left the study. 4. If you accept Billy Kellett's story as true, Lowen is unmistakably implicated. I paused. "Well," I asked, for I felt that I had put my finger on all the vital facts. Poirot looked at me pityingly, shaking his head very gently. "Mon pauvre ami, but it is that you have not the gift. The important detail, you appreciate him never. Also, your reasoning is false." "How?" "Let me take your 4 points. 1. Mr. Lowen could not possibly know that he would have the chance to open the safe. He came for a business interview. He could not know beforehand that Mr. Davenheim would be absent posting a letter, and that he would consequently be alone in the study." "He might have seized his opportunity," I suggested. "And the tools? City gentlemen do not carry round housebreakers' tools on the off chance, and one could not cut into that safe with a penknife, bien entendu." "Well, what about number 2? You say Lowen had a grudge against Mr. Davenheim. What you mean is that he had once or twice got the better of him, and presumably those transactions were entered into with the view of benefiting himself. In any case, you do not as a rule bear a grudge against a man you have got the better of. It is more likely to be the other way about. Whatever grudge there might have been, would have been on Mr. Davenheim's side." "Well, you can't deny that he lied about never having left the study?" "No, but he may have been frightened. Remember, the missing man's clothes had just been discovered in the lake. Of course, as usual, he would have done better to speak the truth." "And the 4th point?" "I grant you that. If Kellett's story is true, Lowen is undeniably implicated. That is what makes the affair so very interesting." "Then I did appreciate one vital fact?" "Perhaps, but you have entirely overlooked the 2 most important points, the ones which undoubtedly hold the clue to the whole matter." "And pray, what are they?" 1. The passion which has grown upon Mr. Davenheim in the last few years for buying jewellery. 2. His trip to Buenos Aires last autumn." "Poirot, you are joking." "I am most serious. Ah, sacred thunder, but I hope Japp will not forget my little commission." But the detective, entering into the spirit of the joke, had remembered it so well that a telegram was handed to Poirot about 11 o'clock the next day. At his request, I opened it and read it out. Husband and wife have occupied separate rooms since last winter. "Aha!" cried Poirot. "And now we are in mid-June. All is solved." I stared at him. "You have no moneys in the Bank of Davenheim and Salmon, mon ami?" "No," I said, wondering. "Why?" "Because I should advise you to withdraw it before it is too late." "Why, what do you expect?" "I expect a big smash in a few days, perhaps sooner. Which reminds me, we will return the compliment of a dépêche to Jap. A pencil, I pray you, and a form. Voilà. Advise you to withdraw any money deposited with firm in question. That will intrigue him, the good Jap. His eyes will open wide, wide. He will not comprehend in the slightest, until tomorrow or the next day." I remained sceptical, but the morrow forced me to render tribute to my friend's remarkable powers. In every paper was a huge headline telling of the sensational failure of the Davenheim Bank. The disappearance of the famous financier took on a totally different aspect in the light of the revelation of the financial affairs of the bank. Before we were halfway through breakfast, the door flew open and Jap rushed in. In his left hand was a paper. In his right was Poirot's telegram, which he banged down on the table in front of my friend. "How did you know, Monsieur Poirot? How the blazes could you know?" Poirot smiled placidly at him. "Ah, mon ami, after your wire, it was a certainty. From the commencement, see you, it struck me that the safe burglary was somewhat remarkable. Jewels, ready money, bearer bonds, all so conveniently arranged for whom? Well, the good Monsieur Davenheim was of those who look after number one, as your saying goes. It seemed almost certain that it was arranged for himself. Then his passion of late years for buying jewellery. How simple. The funds he embezzled, he converted into jewels, very likely replacing them in turn with paste duplicates, and so he put away in a safe place, under another name, a considerable fortune to be enjoyed all in good time when everyone has been thrown off the track. His arrangements completed, he makes an appointment with Mr. Lowen, who has been imprudent enough in the past to cross the great man once or twice, drills a hole in the safe, leaves orders that the guest is to be shown into the study, and walks out of the house. Where? Poirot stopped and stretched out his hand for another boiled egg. He frowned. "It is really insupportable," he murmured, "that every hen lays an egg of a different size. What symmetry can there be on the breakfast table? At least they should sort them in dozens at the shop." "Never mind the eggs," said Jap impatiently. "Let 'em lay 'em square if they like. Tell us where our customer went to when he left the Cedars. That is, if you know." "Eh bien, he went to his hiding place. Ah, this Monsieur Davenheim. There may be some malformation in his grey cells, but they are of the first quality." "Do you know where he is hiding?" "Certainly. It is most ingenious." "For the Lord's sake, tell us then." Poirot gently collected every fragment of shell from his plate, placed them in the egg cup, and reversed the empty eggshell on top of them. This little operation concluded, he smiled on the neat effect, and then beamed affectionately on us both. "Come, my friends, you are men of intelligence. Ask yourselves the question which I asked myself. If I were this man, where should I hide? Hastings, what do you say?" "Well," I said, "I'm rather inclined to think I'd not do a bolt at all. I'd stay in London, in the heart of things, travel by tubes and buses. 10 to 1 I'd never be recognised. There's safety in a crowd." Poirot turned inquiringly to Jap. "I don't agree. Get clear away at once. That's the only chance. I would have had plenty of time to prepare things beforehand. I'd have a yacht waiting with steam up, and I'd be off to one of the most out-of-the-way corners of the world before the hue and cry began." We both looked at Poirot. "What do you say, monsieur?" For a moment he remained silent. Then a very curious smile flitted across his face. "My friends, if I were hiding from the police, do you know where I should hide? In a prison." "What?" "You are seeking Monsieur Davenheim in order to put him in prison. so you never dream of looking to see if he may not be already there." "What do you mean?" "You tell me Madame Davenheim is not a very intelligent woman. Nevertheless, I think that if you took her to Bow Street and confronted her with the man Billy Kellett, she would recognize him, in spite of the fact that he has shaved his beard and moustache and those bushy eyebrows and has cropped his hair close. A woman nearly always knows her husband, though the rest of the world may be deceived." "Billy Kellett? But he's known to the police." "Did I not tell you Davenheim was a clever man? He prepared his alibi long beforehand. He was not in Buenos Aires last autumn. He was creating the character of Billy Kellett, doing 3 months, so that the police should have no suspicions when the time came. He was playing, remember, for a large fortune as well as liberty. It was worthwhile doing the thing thoroughly. Only—" "Yes?" "Eh bien, afterwards he had to wear a false beard and wig, had to make up as himself again, and to sleep with a false beard is not easy. It invites detection. He cannot risk continuing to share the chamber of Madame his wife. You found out for me that for the last 6 months, or ever since his supposed return from Buenos Aires, he and Mrs. Davenheim occupied separate rooms. Then I was sure. Everything fitted in. The gardener who fancied he saw his master going round to the side of the house was quite right. He went to the boathouse, donned his tramp clothes, which you may be sure had been safely hidden from the eyes of his valet, dropped the others in the lake, and proceeded to carry out his plan by pawning the ring in an obvious manner, and then assaulting a policeman, getting himself safely into the haven of Bow Street, where nobody would ever dream of looking for him." "It's impossible," murmured Japp. "Ask Madame," said my friend, smiling. The next day a registered letter lay beside Poirot's plate. He opened it, and a £5 note fluttered out. My friend's brow puckered. "Ah, sacré! But what shall I do with it? I have much remorse. Ce pauvre Japp. Ah, an idea. We will have a little dinner, we three. That consoles me. It was really too easy. I am ashamed. I, who would not rob a child. Mille tonnerres. Mon ami, what have you, that you laugh so heartily? The $1 million bond robbery." "What a number of bond robberies there have been lately," I observed one morning, laying aside the newspaper. "Poirot, let us forsake the science of detection and take to crime instead. You are on the, how do you say it, get-rich-quick tack, eh, mon ami? Well, look at this last coup, the $1 million worth of Liberty bonds which the London and Scottish Bank were sending to New York, and which disappeared in such a remarkable manner on board the Olympia. If it were not for the mal de mer, and the difficulty of practicing the so excellent method of laverguier for a longer time than the few hours of crossing the Channel, I should delight to voyage myself on one of these big liners," murmured Poirot dreamily. "Yes, indeed," I said enthusiastically. "Some of them must be perfect palaces. The swimming baths, the lounges, the restaurant, the palm courts. Really, it must be hard to believe that one is on the sea." "Me, I always know when I'm on the sea," said Poirot sadly. "And all those bagatelles that you enumerate, they say nothing to me. But, my friend, consider for a moment the geniuses that travel as it were incognito. On board these floating palaces, as you so justly call them, one would meet the elite, the haute noblesse of the criminal world." I laughed. "So that's the way your enthusiasm runs. You would have liked to cross swords with the man who sneaked the Liberty bonds?" The landlady interrupted us. "A young lady as wants to see you, Mr. Poirot. Here's her card." The card bore the inscription, "Miss Esme Farquhar," and Poirot, after diving under the table to retrieve a stray crumb, and putting it carefully in the waste-paper basket, nodded to the landlady to admit her. In another minute, one of the most charming girls I have ever seen was ushered into the room. She was perhaps about 25, with big brown eyes and a perfect figure. She was well dressed and perfectly composed in manner. "Sit down, I beg of you, mademoiselle. This is my friend Captain Hastings, who aids me in my little problems." "I am afraid it is a big problem I have brought you today, Monsieur Poirot," said the girl, giving me a pleasant bow as she seated herself. "I dare say you have read about it in the papers. I am referring to the theft of Liberty bonds on the Olympia." Some astonishment must have shown itself in Poirot's face, for she continued quickly. "You are doubtless asking yourself what I have to do with a grave institution like the London and Scottish Bank. In one sense nothing, in another sense everything. You see, Monsieur Poirot, I am engaged to Mr. Philip Ridgway." "Ha ha! And Mr. Philip Ridgway was in charge of the bonds when they were stolen. Of course, no actual blame can attach to him. It was not his fault in any way. Nevertheless, he is half distraught over the matter, and his uncle, I know, insists that he must carelessly have mentioned having them in his possession. It is a terrible setback in his career." "Who is his uncle?" "Mr. Vavasour, Joint General Manager of the London and Scottish Bank. Suppose, Miss Farquhar, that you recount to me the whole story." "Very well. As you know, the bank wished to extend their credits in America, and for this purpose decided to send over $1 million in Liberty bonds. Mr. Vavasour selected his nephew, who had occupied a position of trust in the bank for many years, and who was conversant with all the details of the bank's dealings in New York, to make the trip. The Olympia sailed from Liverpool on the 23rd, and the bonds were handed over to Philip on the morning of that day by Mr. Vavasour and Mr. Shaw, the two joint general managers of the London and Scottish Bank. They were counted, enclosed in a package and sealed in his presence, and he then locked the package at once in his portmanteau." "A portmanteau with an ordinary lock?" "No. Mr. Shaw insisted on a special lock being fitted to it by Hubbs's. Philip, as I say, placed the package at the bottom of the trunk. It was stolen just a few hours before reaching New York. A rigorous search of the whole ship was made, but without result. The bonds seemed literally to have vanished into thin air." Poirot made a grimace. "But they did not vanish absolutely, since I gather that they were sold in small parcels within half an hour of the docking of the Olympia. Well, undoubtedly the next thing is for me to see Mr. Ridgway. I was about to suggest that you should lunch with me at the Cheshire Cheese. Philip will be there. He is meeting me, but does not yet know that I have been consulting you on his behalf." We agreed to this suggestion readily enough and drove there in a taxi. Mr. Philip Ridgway was there before us, and looked somewhat surprised to see his fiancée arriving with two complete strangers. He was a nice-looking young fellow, tall and spruce, with a touch of greying hair at the temples, though he could not have been much over 30. Miss Farquhar went up to him and laid her hand on his arm. "You must forgive my acting without consulting you, Philip," she said. "Let me introduce you to Monsieur Hercule Poirot, of whom you must often have heard, and his friend, Captain Hastings." Ridgway looked very astonished. "Of course I have heard of you, Monsieur Poirot," he said, as he shook hands, "but I had no idea that Esme was thinking of consulting you about our trouble." "I was afraid you would not let me do it, Philip," said Miss Farquhar meekly. "So you took care to be on the safe side," he observed with a smile. "I hope Monsieur Poirot will be able to throw some light on this extraordinary puzzle, for I confess frankly that I am nearly out of my mind with worry and anxiety about it." Indeed, his face looked drawn and haggard, and showed only too clearly the strain under which he was labouring. "Well, well," said Poirot. "Let us lunch, and over lunch we will put our heads together and see what can be done. I want to hear Mr. Ridgway's story from his own lips." Whilst we discussed the excellent steak and kidney pudding of the establishment, Philip Ridgway narrated the circumstances leading to the disappearance of the bonds. His story agreed with that of Miss Farquhar in every particular. When he had finished, Poirot took up the thread with a question. "What exactly led you to discover that the bonds had been stolen, Mr. Ridgway?" He laughed rather bitterly. "The thing stared me in the face, Monsieur Poirot. I couldn't have missed it. My cabin trunk was half out from under the bunk and all scratched and cut about where they'd tried to force the lock." "But I understood that it had been opened with a key." "That's so. They tried to force it but couldn't. And in the end, they must have got it unlocked somehow or other." "Curious," said Poirot, his eyes beginning to flicker with the green light I knew so well. "Very curious. They waste much time trying to prise it open, and then, sapristi, they find that they have the key all the time, for each of Hubbs's locks are unique." "That's just why they couldn't have had the key," It never left me day or night." "You are sure of that?" "I can swear to it, and besides, if they had had the key or a duplicate, why should they waste time trying to force an obviously unforceable lock?" "Ah, there is exactly the question we are asking ourselves. I venture to prophesy that the solution, if we ever find it, will hinge on that curious fact. I beg of you not to assault me if I ask you one more question. Are you perfectly certain you did not leave the trunk unlocked?" Philip Ridgway merely looked at him, and Poirot gesticulated apologetically. "Ah, but these things can happen, I assure you. Very well, the bonds were stolen from the trunk. What did the thief do with them? How did he manage to get ashore with them?" "Ah," cried Ridgway. "That's just it. How? Word was passed to the customs authorities, and every soul that left the ship was gone over with a tooth comb." "And the bonds, I gather, made a bulky package?" "Certainly they did. They could hardly have been hidden on board, and anyway we know they weren't because they were offered for sale within half an hour of the Olympia's arrival, long before I got the cables going and the numbers sent out. One broker swears he bought some of them even before the Olympia got in, but you can't send bonds by wireless." "Not by wireless, but did any tug come alongside?" "Only the official ones, and that was after the alarm was given when everyone was on the lookout. I was watching out myself for their being passed over to someone that way. My God, Monsieur Poirot, this thing will drive me mad. People are beginning to say I stole them myself." "But you also were searched on landing, weren't you?" asked Poirot gently. "Yes." The young man stared at him in a puzzled manner. "You do not catch my meaning, I see," said Poirot, smiling enigmatically. "Now I should like to make a few inquiries at the bank." Ridgway produced a card and scribbled a few words on it. "Send this in, and my uncle will see you at once." Poirot thanked him, bade farewell to Miss Farquhar, and together we started out for Threadneedle Street and the head office of the London and Scottish Bank. On production of Ridgway's card, we were led through the labyrinth of counters and desks, skirting paying-in clerks and paying-out clerks, and up to a small office on the first floor where the joint general managers received us. They were two grave gentlemen who had grown grey in the service of the bank. Mr. Vavasour had a short white beard. Mr. Shaw was clean-shaven. "I understand you are strictly a private inquiry agent," said Mr. Vavasour. "Quite so, quite so. We have, of course, placed ourselves in the hands of Scotland Yard. Inspector McNeill has charge of the case. A very able officer, I believe." "I am sure of it," said Poirot politely. "You will permit a few questions on your nephew's behalf? About this lock? Who ordered it from Hubbs's?" "I ordered it myself," said Mr. Shaw. "I would not trust to any clerk in the matter. As to the keys, Mr. Ridgway had one, and the other two are held by my colleague and myself." "And no clerk has had access to them?" Mr. Shaw turned inquiringly to Mr. Vavasour. "I think I am correct in saying that they have remained in the safe where we placed them on the 23rd, said Mr. Vavasour. "My colleague was unfortunately taken ill a fortnight ago, in fact on the very day that Philip left us. He has only just recovered." "Severe bronchitis is no joke to a man of my age," said Mr. Shaw ruefully. "But I am afraid Mr. Vavasour has suffered from the hard work entailed by my absence, especially with this unexpected worry coming on top of everything." Poirot asked a few more questions. I judged that he was endeavouring to gauge the exact amount of intimacy between uncle and nephew. Mr. Vavasour's answers were brief and punctilious. His nephew was a trusted official of the bank, and had no debts or money difficulties that he knew of. He had been entrusted with similar missions in the past. Finally, we were politely bowed out. "I am disappointed," said Poirot, as we emerged into the street. "You hope to discover more. They are such stodgy old men." "It is not their stodginess which disappoints me, mon ami. I do not expect to find in a bank manager a keen financier with an eagle glance, as your favourite works of fiction put it. No, I am disappointed in the case. It is too easy." "Easy?" "Yes, do you not find it almost childishly simple?" "You know who stole the bonds?" "I do." "But then, we must— Why—" "Do not confuse and fluster yourself, Hastings. We are not going to do anything at present. But why? What are you waiting for? For the Olympia. She is due on her return trip from New York on Tuesday. But if you know who stole the bonds, why wait? He may escape. To a South Sea island where there is no extradition? No, mon ami, he would find life very uncongenial there. As to why I wait, eh bien, to the intelligence of Hercule Poirot the case is perfectly clear, but for the benefit of others, not so greatly gifted by the good God, the Inspector McNeil, for instance, it would be as well to make a few inquiries to establish the facts. One must have consideration for those less gifted than oneself. Good Lord, Poirot, do you know, I'd give a considerable sum of money to see you make a thorough ass of yourself, just for once. You're so confoundedly conceited. Do not enrage yourself, Hastings. In verity, I observe that there are times when you almost detest me. Alas, I suffer the penalties of greatness. The little man puffed out his chest and sighed so comically that I was forced to laugh. Tuesday saw us speeding to Liverpool in a first-class carriage of the L&N-WR. Poirot had obstinately refused to enlighten me as to his suspicions, or certainties. He contented himself with expressing surprise that I, too, was not equally au fait with the situation. I disdained to argue, and entrenched my curiosity behind a rampart of pretended indifference. Once arrived at the quay alongside which lay the big transatlantic liner, Poirot became brisk and alert. Our proceedings consisted in interviewing 4 successive stewards and inquiring after a friend of Poirot's who had crossed to New York on the 23rd. An elderly gentleman, wearing glasses, a great invalid, hardly moved out of his cabin. The description appeared to tally with one Mr. Ventnor who had occupied the cabin C-24, which was next to that of Philip Ridgway. Although unable to see how Poirot had deduced Mr. Ventnor's existence and personal appearance, I was keenly excited. "Tell me," I cried, "was this gentleman one of the first to land when you got to New York?" The steward shook his head. "No, indeed, sir. He was one of the last off the boat." I retired crestfallen, and observed Poirot grinning at me. He thanked the steward, a note changed hands, and we took our departure. "It's all very well," I remarked heatedly, "but that last answer must have damped your precious theory. Grin as you please." "As usual, you see nothing, Hastings. That last answer is, on the contrary, the coping stone of my theory." I flung up my hands in despair. "I give it up." When we were in the train, speeding towards London, Poirot wrote busily for a few minutes, sealing up the result in an envelope. "This is for the good Inspector McNeil. We will leave it at Scotland Yard in passing, and then to the Rendezvous restaurant, where I have asked Miss Esme Farquhar to do us the honour of dining with us." "What about Ridgway?" "What about him?" asked Poirot with a twinkle. "Why, you surely don't think— You can't— The habit of incoherence is growing upon you, Hastings. As a matter of fact, I did think. If Ridgway had been the thief, which was perfectly possible, the case would have been charming, a piece of neat methodical work. But not so charming for Miss Farquhar. Possibly you are right, therefore all is for the best. Now, Hastings, let us review the case. I can see that you are dying to do so. The sealed package is removed from the trunk and vanishes, as Miss Farquhar puts it, into thin air. We will dismiss the thin air theory, which is not practicable at the present stage of science, and consider what is likely to have become of it. Everyone asserts the incredibility of its being smuggled ashore. Yes, but we know. You may know, Hastings. I do not. I take the view that since it seemed incredible, it was incredible. 2 possibilities remain. It was hidden on board, also rather difficult, or it was thrown overboard. With a cork on it, do you mean? Without a cork. I stared. But if the bonds were thrown overboard, they couldn't have been sold in New York. I admire your logical mind, Hastings. The bonds were sold in New York, therefore they were not thrown overboard. You see where that leads us? Where we were when we started. Jamais de la vie. If the package was thrown overboard and the bonds were sold in New York, the package could not have contained the bonds. Is there any evidence that the package did contain the bonds? Remember, Mr. Ridgway never opened it from the time it was placed in his hands in London. Yes, but then— Poirot waved an impatient hand. Permit me to continue. The last moment that the bonds are seen as bonds is in the office of the London and Scottish Bank on the morning of the 23rd. They reappear in New York half an hour after the Olympia gets in, and according to one man, whom nobody listens to, actually before she gets in. Supposing, then, that they have never been on the Olympia at all, is there any other way they could get to New York? Yes. The Gigantic leaves Southampton on the same day as the Olympia, and she holds the record for the Atlantic. Mailed by the Gigantic, the bonds would be in New York the day before the Olympia arrived. All is clear, the case begins to explain itself. The sealed packet is only a dummy, and the moment of its substitution must be in the office in the bank. It would be an easy matter for any of the three men present to have prepared a duplicate package which could be substituted for the genuine one. Très bien. The bonds are mailed to a confederate in New York, with instructions to sell as soon as the Olympia is in, but someone must travel on the Olympia to engineer the supposed moment of the robbery. But why? Because if Ridgway merely opens the packet and finds it a dummy, suspicion flies at once to London. No, the man on board in the cabin next door does his work, pretends to force the lock in an obvious manner so as to draw immediate attention to the theft, really unlocks the trunk with a duplicate key, throws the package overboard, and waits until the last to leave the boat. Naturally, he wears glasses to conceal his eyes, and is an invalid since he does not want to run the risk of meeting Ridgway. He steps ashore in New York and returns by the first boat available. But who? Which was he? The man who had a duplicate key, the man who ordered the lock, the man who has not been severely ill with bronchitis at his home in the country. And that stodgy old man, Mr. Shaw. There are criminals in high places sometimes, my friend. Ah, here we are. Mademoiselle, I have succeeded. You permit? And beaming, Poirot kissed the astonished girl lightly on either cheek. Thank you very much for listening to this story, narrated by Jason Fraser. Don't forget to subscribe to the Detective Tales channel and be sure to leave a comment.